Hey, Rachel.
Hey, Chris.
You know what I think would be really fun to do on October 22nd?
What?
We should both give the sermon.
Both give the sermon?
Yes. It's kind of an interesting gospel. It seems easy at first, but then it raises some really hard questions about things like loyalty, stewardship, and everyone's favorite topic, money. I thought maybe we'd both have something to say about that.
Oh, I get it. You mean it's a really hard gospel passage and you want my help?
So that's more or less how today's idea for a dialogical sermon got started. Over the past 2 weeks, we've had 3 or 4 conversations about what today's gospel opens up for us.
We started by trying to unpack Jesus' famous teaching at the end. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Seems pretty easy, right? Not only does it translate into our English language with elegant grammar, it also translates into our American culture as a kind of first-century affirmation of the separation of church and state. It's easy. Jesus wants us to pay our taxes to the state and pledge to the church. Got it? Done.
But that's not at all what Jesus meant. As a first-century Jew, he would hardly have believed in the separation of church and state.
And besides, there was no church yet when Jesus was alive.
Exactly. That's why this passage is deceptive to our 21st century ears. You know what Jesus would have believed in as a first-century Jew?
What?
Loyalty to God. And that's what this passage is all about revealing one's true loyalties, not just in words, but in action. In today's story, the Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus, to get him to pick a side in an ongoing debate about whether to be loyal to God or the emperor between these two factions of Jews. On the one side are the Herodians, who support the Romans' colonial ruler named Herod, hence Herodians. They think that faithful Jews should pay taxes to the emperor. On the other side are the Pharisee Jews, who believe that paying tribute money to an emperor who has conquered God's people violates God's law and makes Jews impure. Now, the Pharisees don't actually care which side Jesus picks. They either want Jesus to admit that faithful Jews shouldn't pay the Roman tax, and then the Herodians get mad at him, or they want Jesus to admit that faithful Jews should pay the Roman tax because it would anger the Pharisees' own disciples. Either way, Jesus turns one group against him.
But how does it help us understand the meaning of the give to Caesar piece?
Okay, it has to do with the coins, those Roman coins, the denarius. Roman coins were considered unclean according to the law because the inscription on the coin itself was blasphemous. It said, "This is Caesar, God among us." No Pharisee who labored hard to be loyal to God's law would ever touch such a blasphemous image. So when Jesus asks the disciples of the Pharisees to produce the coin with which you pay the tax, and they do it, standing in the middle of the temple, the holiest place on earth for Jews, the Pharisees' disciples are immediately revealed to be hypocrites. Their actions are not aligned with their professed loyalty to God. Their secret complicity in paying the tax compromises their values. And so Jesus responds, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God's what is God's." It's not an argument for separate spheres of church and state. Rather, it's a challenge to them and to us. A reminder that God longs for our loyalty in all aspects of our lives, all of them.
I've been really surprised at my reaction as we've teased this thread of loyalty to God out within this passage, which did take us a good deal of time. Normally, for me, especially coming from my incredibly progressive congregational church growing up, the word loyalty is a word that leads me to close off. It brings up the one elderly finger-wagging woman in my childhood congregation who guarded the coffee hour breads and clearly felt that the faith that my youth group friends and I had developed was just that, air quotes faith. Not hardcore enough, not loyal enough to some strict set of expectations and rules. Loyalty felt to me like a word that only comes up if you haven't been loyal, like its whole purpose is to reveal our insufficiency. Are you going to be at the table with the bread? It's really good this week.
So then, after a few more conversations, as we explored this idea of what total loyalty to God might be like, something shifted for you, and you seemed to really connect to it.
I did. One of the things that I loved about our conversations this week is that before them, as I said, I experienced loyalty as emblematic of all in the church that was limiting and admonishing. Yet, after our wrestling with how to articulate what we were both coming to understand as liberating in the passage, it was really the best word, and we tried a number of different words.
And that's something that actually I experience fairly frequently too, when I spend significant time with a Bible passage, enough time to really dig in, to really try to get to the meat of it. When I do that, something that initially might seem threatening or scary or off-putting or limiting actually opens up and is transformed into something that's really life-giving for me.
Yeah, it does seem counterintuitive that God's desire for our complete loyalty would actually be freeing, except that it is.
Yes, exactly. And say more, if you would, about that, because it really took us a long time to figure out that that was what we felt. I mean, we sensed it intuitively that this was something that we should lean into, but it did take us a while to kind of get there.
It did, but we did finally come to understand it. For me, I got it when you were actually talking about how this passage might inform stewardship, particularly budgeting. Budgeting and spending, as most of us know, can be a stressful thing. And there's often this feeling of scarcity about it, even when we have money to give away, because we never have enough to give to all the things that are important to us, or we rarely have enough to do that. I've always thought of my and David's financial resources in two buckets. There's the bucket of stuff that makes life go or makes life more comfortable, but doesn't actually help anyone. Groceries, rent, insurance, car payments, phone bills, internet costs, sneakers, soccer uniforms, after-school care, more books than I can read or clothes than I need, and it goes on and on and on. That bucket feels huge. It is by far the bulk of our expenditures. The other is the bucket, in my mind, for doing good work. Perhaps before our conversation, I would have even thought of it as the bucket for God's work. Charity donations and my pledge here. That bucket, in relation to the first bucket, feels tiny. So the bucket in my mind that actually makes a difference in the world is the tiny bucket.
That's not a good feeling, is it?
No. But then you posed a guiding question that was initially terrifying, but ultimately reframed things, I think for both of us, in a whole new way. You asked, what if there is no me bucket or us bucket and no God bucket? What if God actually wants all of it, everything? What if in God's eyes, everything we have is meant to glorify God?
It was also terrifying for me when I said it out loud. But really, it's the foundation of Christian stewardship. God does not just want the part of us that is left over, whether it's the part that's left over after work or the part that's left over after taxes. God wants our whole loyalty in every part of our lives. I am the Lord, says the prophet Isaiah. There is no other. That means everything. And it changes everything.
Exactly. So now when I come to look at our budget and our expenditures this way, lots of things in that first giant bucket help me be loyal to God. Groceries and rent, those are related to my commitment to nourish not only myself, a child of God, but those other children of God who are in my care, Simon and Kate and David. Car payments enable us all, my family, to get all over the place, to nourish relationships with family and friends, which build up love and care in the world, and to enable me to get out here, to minister among all of you where I feel so very called by God to God's work. Soccer uniforms are my commitment to Simon and Kate's pure joy and growing confidence in their bodies, rather than, as would be something David and I more often affirm, just their minds. That question you posed has made me see so very clearly that the bucket that is doing God's work is actually far larger than the bucket that isn't. And now, too, I can see clearly what actually is in the bucket that isn't doing God's work: the too many new clothes and the latest tech gadgets. I actually feel much freer to scale back on those now that I see where God is in all that I financially commit to.
I see fewer iced lattes in my future. But the irony is, I feel really good about that possibility. Because the real good news in all of this is the reminder that so much of what we seemingly do out of routine or obligation to those around us actually may be very deeply aligned with our commitment to God.
Yes, and that seeing that, and seeing how our obligations are related to our commitment to God, liberates us to experience those commitments as faith deepening, rather than as somehow devoid of meaning or purpose or extraneous or something we shouldn't be committing to.
And that's really the true work of stewardship for all of us. Coming to appreciate a broad view of how our actions and our spending reflects our loyalty to God, or in some cases, doesn't. Stewardship is far more than just about increasing our pledge to the church each year to try to get to, say, 10% of our income. It's about increasing our pledge to God until that reaches 100% of our whole life, 100% of our time serving God's mission, 100% of our talent put towards the building up of God's kingdom, 100% of our treasure working to serve the purposes of embedding God's love and embodying it in this world. Until all of who we are and all of what we have is going towards building up the wholeness of the church, the wholeness of our families, the wholeness of our communities, the wholeness of our earth. Until then, we won't be able to approach wholeness in ourselves. In this season of stewardship, as we look at our budgets and our pledge cards and our world, may we find a sense of freedom in remembering that God longs for every part of your life to be a sacred offering to the mercy and blessing of God.